Thus far, we've covered many of the documents, witness interviews, and trial transcripts from when Jim Garrison prosecuted New Orleans businessman Clay Shaw for conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. This prosecution was the focus of Oliver Stone's iconic film JFK, where Garrison was played by Kevin Costner and Clay Shaw was played by Tommy Lee Jones. The Clay Shaw trial is jam-packed with information and subplots, enough to cover many, many episodes. But for now, in the interest of keeping it high level, we're just going to cover the greatest hits in the trial of Clay Shaw. If you want to learn more about the trial and the investigation, there are many books that focus on it. On the Warren Report critics side, I recommend Destiny Betrayed by James DiEugenio and A Farewell to Justice by Joan Mellon. For a first-hand account, there's also Garrison's own book about the case called On the Trail of Assassins. To get the Warren Report Defender viewpoint, I recommend On the Trail of Delusion by Fred Litwin. As far as podcasts go, my friend Jeff Crudell has a great series of about 30 episodes on the Garrison case on his show, JFK, The Enduring Secret. In this episode, we try to answer the big questions about Jim Garrison's case. What started it? Who was Clay Shaw? Was he the same person as Clay Bertrand? What was Garrison's theory of the case? And was Garrison able to establish the facts that he set out to prove?
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Dallas police this morning resumed questioning the man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm just a patsy.
The man is Lee Oswald.
Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? The mission answers, he acted alone.
I'm working I'm just a patsy.
This is Solving JFK. I'm your host, Matt Crumpton. On November 25th, 1963, the Monday after the assassination and the day after Jack Ruby killed Oswald, Jim Garrison learned about the allegations that were made by Jack Martin after he had been pistol whipped by Guy Bannister, which we covered in episode 48. Those allegations, which made their way to Garrison's assistant DA Herman Coleman, included that David Ferry was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy, specifically as the getaway pilot. Garrison then sent an investigator to Ferry's house, where he found 2 young men waiting for Ferry to return. There was a large map of Cuba on the wall, army rifles, and mice that were apparently being used by Ferry for medical research. The 2 guys at Ferry's house said that he left for Texas in his car on the day of the assassination. On Monday, November 25th, Garrison then brought Ferry in for questioning. Ferry denied ever knowing Oswald, which we know is false given all of the evidence that he knew Oswald in the Civil Air Patrol. He told Garrison that the reason he left New Orleans on the day of the assassination was so that he and his 2 friends could go ice skating in Houston. Ferry was accompanied by Alvin Babuff and Melvin Coffey. The 3 men drove the 400 miles from New Orleans to Houston, where they checked into a motel on the night of the 22nd and then went ice skating during the day on November 23rd. According to Chuck Rowland, the manager of the skating rink, Ferry spent most of his time near a payphone, and he never saw Ferry on the ice rink. On the other hand, Ferry told the FBI that he did go ice skating. After the skating rink, the trio then went to Galveston, a coastal town about an hour from Houston. They stayed at the Driftwood Motel for just one night. It's unclear what the point of the Galveston trip was because they checked into the motel at 11 p.m. and then left the next morning at 10 o'clock as they made their way back to New Orleans. Author Fred Litwin interviewed Al Babeuf in 2020. He told Litwin that it was his idea to go ice skating on the day of the assassination and that they chose to go to Houston because there was no ice skating rink in New Orleans and a road trip sounded fun. Garrison did not find anything that directly connected Ferry to the assassination, but he didn't believe Ferry's story about this sudden ice skating trip on the day Kennedy was killed. Garrison then detained Ferry until he could be questioned by the FBI. The district attorney and former FBI agent himself was confident that the FBI would do a good faith, thorough investigation and left the matter with them. Clay Shaw was born in Kentwood, Louisiana. He eventually attended Columbia University before enlisting in the Army during World War II, where he served honorably in France and Belgium. In the Army, Shaw was responsible for coordinating the activities of intelligence and counterintelligence groups. When Shaw returned from the war, he helped to start the International Trade Mart in New Orleans, which promoted international trade. Clay Shaw first appeared on the radar of the CIA on December 13, 1948. His name was on a document that was in relation to a trade exhibit at the International Trade Mart by the Czechoslovakian government. The next year, Shaw was briefed by the CIA before leaving on a 3-month tour of Latin America. When he came back, Shaw provided the CIA with information on Peru, Nicaragua, and Argentina. In 1952, Shaw gave the CIA's Foreign Documents Division a directory of German companies that were doing international business. The public relations director at the International Trade Mart from 1952 until 1955 was David Baldwin. According to a May 24, 1967 memo from Bill Martin to Jim Garrison, Baldwin was a covert agent of the CIA. The memo says, quote, "It was told to me that during his employment at the Trade Mart, David Baldwin succeeded in recruiting Clay Shaw for CIA operations, or conversely, that Clay Shaw had already been recruited by the CIA by the time of Baldwin's employment, and that his employment of Baldwin was suggested or sponsored by the CIA." An August 9, 1955 CIA memo says that an unnamed person and Clay Shaw would be willing to attend a trade expo in Czechoslovakia, quote, as a CIA observer, but ostensibly, of course, as the representative of redacted or the International Trade Mart, as the case may be, provided the expense could be borne by CIA. The memo then called Shaw a, quote, valued source of this office. A May 25, 1956 memo says, quote, "If we can furnish Mr. Shaw with the names and addresses of producers of mercury in Spain and Italy, he is quite willing to write letters of inquiry to them on World Trade Development Department letterhead in an attempt to ascertain for us the extent of the Spanish and Italian stocks on hand." Victor Marchetti was a special assistant to the deputy director of the CIA. He retired from the agency in 1969 and became a prominent critic. In 1973, via press release, Marchetti made some show-stopping claims about Clay Shaw, including that Shaw was a paid contact for the CIA, that David Ferry was a confirmed CIA operative, and that Marchetti himself sat in on meetings where high-level CIA officials expressed interest in helping Clay Shaw and concern that Shaw's CIA relationship may be uncovered. Now, none of this information proves that Clay Shaw was involved in the JFK assassination, but it does conclusively establish that Shaw was a reliable, frequently used, and effective CIA asset. Apparently, Clay Shaw knew Guy Bannister and frequently visited his office. Tommy Baumler, who worked for Bannister infiltrating college leftist groups, said that Clay Shaw and Bannister were close and that Shaw, Bannister, and Naval Intelligence Officer Guy Johnson, quote, made up the intelligence apparatus in New Orleans. Joe Newbrough, who also worked in Bannister's office, recalled being asked by Bannister to get Clay Shaw on the phone, and when he did, Bannister told him to give the phone to David Ferry, who was also in the office. At his trial, Clay Shaw denied being associated in any way with David Ferry. But aside from the witnesses who saw Shaw with Ferry in Clinton and Jackson, there are other people who saw the men together. FBI informant and owner of the Habana Bar in New Orleans, Orest Pena, said that he saw Ferry and Shaw together on many occasions. Jules Kimball told Jim Garrison that he once took a plane trip with Shaw that Ferry piloted from New Orleans to Montreal. David Logan said that he was introduced to Shaw by David Ferry and that he later had a relationship with Shaw. Nicholas and Matilda Tadine met with David Ferry at the airport because they wanted Ferry to give their son flying lessons. When they arrived, they saw Ferry walking out of the hangar and talking to Clay Shaw, who Nicholas already knew and recognized as the director of the International Trade Mart. In preparation for trial, Clay Shaw's attorneys commissioned a report by the Wackenhut Detective Agency. In that report, Sandra Anderson, G. Ray Gill's secretary, said that she had seen a photo of Shaw and David Ferry together. Aura Lee was Clay Shaw's former secretary at the International Trade Mart. She said that she saw David Ferry go into Clay Shaw's office several times. In fact, it happened so often that she thought Ferry had privileged entry to his office. Then there's Woodrow Hardy, who was overseeing Clay Shaw's French Quarter real estate and went to Shaw's house to talk about renovations. Hardy had worked for Shaw so long that he had a key to his house and let himself in. According to what Hardy told his lawyer, when he came in the house, he saw Shaw talking to David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald. Shaw then got up and escorted Hardy out of the house, making it clear that it was not a good time for him to be there. Finally, according to Lillian Moret, Oswald's aunt who he stayed with when he first arrived in New Orleans, Shaw came to her door asking for Lee in late September of 1963 after Oswald had already left New Orleans. Remember attorney Dean Andrews? He's the lawyer who said that Oswald told him he was being paid by someone to hand out fair play for Cuba flyers. But it turns out Andrews actually had a lot to say about Clay Bertrand. He told the Warren Commission that while he was being treated for pneumonia, he received a phone call in his hospital room from Clay Bertrand. Bertrand then asked Andrews to go to Dallas to defend Lee Harvey Oswald. This call either happened on the day of the assassination or the day after. Andrews said that he thought Bertrand had previously referred work to him, including Lee Harvey Oswald. If this story is true, it makes the identity of Clay Bertrand very important because he appears to be someone who's close to Oswald. The argument against this incident being valid is that Andrews was heavily sedated from being in the hospital. However, Andrews confirmed that the time of the call was around dinner at 5 p.m., whereas the time of his sedation was at 8 p.m. Andrews also spoke to his secretary, Eva Springer, about this legal representation, and Springer corroborated that phone call. Andrews then called attorney Monk Zeldin to see if he would help Andrews represent Oswald. This is when Andrews found out that Oswald had just been killed and would no longer need an attorney. Jim Garrison met with Andrews for lunch in early 1967 and asked him Clay Bertrand's true identity. Andrews said that he didn't know what Bertrand looked like. Garrison pressured Andrews to tell the truth or to face perjury charges, to which Andrews replied that if he revealed the identity of Clay Bertrand, quote, "It's goodbye, Dean Andrews. I mean, like a bullet in my head." Andrews may have had good reason to be worried. He told the Warren Commission that after the assassination, his office was broken into and rifled through. In the Shaw trial, Andrews told the grand jury that Bertrand was actually a man named Eugene Davis, who was Andrews' friend. Eugene Davis then denied that he was Clay Bertrand through an affidavit. At trial, Dean Andrews said that Bertrand was a figment of his imagination who did not exist at all. This led to Garrison prosecuting Dean Andrews for perjury. When Jim Garrison's investigators interviewed Dr. Jacob Ketty, he said that he did not know Clay Shaw, but he said that a friend of his named Greg Donnelly did. When Dr. Ketty was explaining this, he said, quote, "Yeah, he knew Clay Bertrand, Laverne his name was. He'd known him for years. Clay Shaw's middle name was Laverne. But that's quite a coincidence if Dr. Ketty happened to just misspeak and the word he misspoke was Bertrand when he meant to say Laverne." Jessie Parker was a hostess at the Eastern Airlines VIP room at the New Orleans airport. She said that a man signed in to the register in December of 1966 under the name Clay Bertrand, and that this man met the description of Clay Shaw. Parker testified to these facts during Shaw's trial, but her testimony varies on the details, like whether or not the Venezuelans who were with Bertrand also signed the book. Additionally, the man who signed the guest book immediately after Clay Bertrand, Arthur Davis, said that he knew Clay Shaw and he did not see Clay Shaw in the Eastern Airlines VIP room. Thomas Breitner claims that he met Clay Shaw around the time of the assassination at UC Berkeley, which is consistent with Shaw's known travel schedule. Breitner also claims that Shaw introduced himself as Clay Bertrand, different from Bertrand, but not by much. On the other hand, Breitner didn't provide that fact until the third time he spoke to Garrison's office. Aaron Cohn from the Metropolitan Crime Commission and FBI informant Joe Oster, who used to work for Guy Bannister, both told the FBI that Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand. Cohn apparently didn't have any independent corroboration for his story, and Oster failed to mention the part about Bertrand in his first statement. Probably the strongest evidence that Shaw was Clay Bertrand is that the police officer who filled out the booking sheet for Shaw wrote that Shaw's alias was Clay Bertrand. Patrolman Aloysius Habighorst said that he asked Shaw the standard questions on the booking sheet, and Shaw responded with Clay Bertrand when he was asked if he had any aliases. But Shaw later denied that he had ever said that. The officer who was the closest to Shaw and Habighorst at the time the booking sheet was being filled out was Sergeant Jonas Butzman. Butzman said that he did not hear Shaw say anything about having an alias. However, Butzman gave conflicting statements about whether or not he was able to hear what Shaw and Habighorst were saying. It's not crystal clear that Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand. There are enough witnesses for me to believe that Bertrand most likely was Clay Shaw, including, most notably, the booking officer who documented Bertrand on the booking sheet in the alias section. Jim Garrison, having been a former FBI agent himself, left the investigation of the Kennedy assassination up to the Bureau because he trusted the institution. While Garrison kept up with the case and even wrote a few memos about it in 1965 and 1966, the catalyst for Garrison to pursue the Kennedy assassination in his own backyard was when he sat next to Louisiana Senator Russell Long on an airplane. Senator Long shared aspects of the case with Garrison that he wasn't aware of. This led Garrison to read the Warren Report volumes and books that were critical of the Warren Commission. At the beginning, Garrison's prime suspect was David Ferrie, but the focus shifted to Clay Shaw after Ferrie turned up dead just as the case was getting started. David Ferrie died on February 22, 1967, about 1 week after the news of Garrison's investigation became public. But David Ferrie's death remains mysterious because, aside from the timing, 2 documents were found at his apartment that make it look like it could have been a suicide: a will and a note that hinted at Ferrie leaving this world. Garrison said that he wouldn't rule out murder as the cause of death for David Ferrie. Lou Ivon, a Garrison investigator, said that Ferrie called him the day after the story of Garrison's investigation broke. Ferrie told Ivon, quote, "You know what this news story does to me, don't you? I'm a dead man. From here on, believe me, I'm a dead man." Ultimately, Garrison's theory of the case against Clay Shaw was based on testimony from 25-year-old insurance salesman Perry Russo. Russo testified at trial that in September of 1963, he was at a party at David Ferrie's house that was also attended by a man named Clay Bertrand, who Russo identified at trial as Clay Shaw, and a man introduced to him as Leon Oswald, who Russo could not identify as Lee Harvey Oswald until facial hair was added by an artist, at which time Russo did say that Leon Oswald was Lee Harvey Oswald. Russo knew David Ferrie well. He testified that Ferrie had been to his house about a dozen times, and he had been to Ferrie's apartment 30 or 40 times. Russo claimed that after everyone else had left the party, he was still there, and he overheard a conversation between Ferrie, Shaw, and Oswald about killing President Kennedy, including, quote, the triangulation of crossfire, as well as planned alibis for the participants. Russo claimed that Ferrie and Shaw said it was important for them to be in the public eye at the time of the shooting. Ferrie said that he would be in Hammond, Louisiana, and Shaw said that he'd be on a business trip on the West Coast. On the day of the assassination, David Ferrie traveled to Houston, but he did stop in Hammond on the way back. And Clay Shaw was scheduled to give a speech on the West Coast in San Francisco. Jim Garrison says in his book that he wanted to confirm the veracity of what Perry Russo was saying because he knew that Russo would be a very important witness and that lie detector tests were not reliable. So Garrison chose to use hypnosis and sodium pentothal, which was administered to Russo under close medical supervision. Garrison also pointed out that this practice was completely legit. The two practitioners were both, quote, evaluated by the 3-judge panel as qualified experts on truth verification by sodium pentothal and hypnosis. Sodium pentothal is a barbiturate that slows down your higher level thinking. The drug can effectively work as a truth serum, but there's a major caveat. When you're under the influence of sodium pentothal, you are extremely open to the suggestions of others, which means that there's a good chance that you can just be telling your questioner whatever they want to hear. The biggest issue with Perry Russo's story is the documentation supporting it. In a memo dated February 27, 1967, Assistant New Orleans DA Andrew Chambra memorialized his interview with Perry Russo in Baton Rouge. The memo basically said that Russo knew David Ferry, Ferry knew Cubans and trained in jungle warfare, and that Ferry had been talking about killing the president and how easy it would be. Notably absent from Chambra's first memo was any mention of seeing Leon Oswald or Clay Bertrand. The only character in this first memo is David Ferry. Russo was then given sodium pentothal and mentioned Clay Bertrand and Leon Oswald, who Russo said had messy hair and a beard. He also talked about Ferry, Oswald, and Bertrand discussing killing President Kennedy, which is what the final story ended up being. Assistant DA Chambra didn't capture any of the key points of Russo's tantalizing story in his first memo. He only had the David Ferry parts. Chambra says that Russo did say those things, he just didn't include them in the original memo because he was focused on finishing the memo about the sodium pentothal treatment first. James Felon wrote for the Saturday Evening Post and worked on the Garrison case as an investigator before later turning on Garrison and actively working against him. Felon summarized the argument against the credibility of Chambra's memos this way, quote, "They would have us believe that Chambra located a witness to a conspiracy to commit the crime of the century, that Chambra took notes on a 3-hour interview during which Russo spelled out a sensationally detailed story, that he then returned to New Orleans and wrote a 3,500-word memo in which he managed to leave out all of the relevant testimony, and then he burned his original notes." And again, both Chambra and Perry Russo say that they discussed the party at Ferry's house with Bertrand and Oswald and the crossfire conversation during that first 3-hour interview. Their story appears to be supported by the search warrant, which says, quote, "Said confidential informant while under sodium pentothal verified, corroborated, and reaffirmed his earlier statements." Still, it's hard to reconcile how the main points didn't make their way into that first memo. These problems with the timing of Chambra's memo aren't the only issue with Perry Russo's testimony. According to Russo, Jim Garrison granted favors to him before the trial, including contacting the governor and asking him to call the chancellor at LSU to reinstate a friend of Russo's who had been kicked out. Russo also claimed that Garrison helped another friend avoid being drafted into the Vietnam War by participating in a scheme to create false criminal charges against him, which did, in fact, allow Russo's friend to avoid being drafted. Also, Russo's friend, Lefty Peterson, spoke to Clay Shaw's lawyers and told them that he did attend a party at David Ferry's apartment with Russo, but he didn't see Oswald or Shaw. Additionally, there's the idea that the story on its face is just implausible. As first-generation researcher and author Sylvia Maher put it, quote, "I can scarcely believe that 3 conspirators negotiated a plan to assassinate President Kennedy in the presence of a 4th person whom they left at liberty to inform on them whenever the spirit moved him." For me, I would not be able to find that Clay Shaw was a conspirator in the murder of President Kennedy when presented with this evidence. My take on the Perry Russo story is that he did know David Ferry. He probably went to a party at Ferry's house and heard Ferry freaking out about wanting to kill Kennedy. But I just don't think that it's sufficiently established that Oswald and Shaw were there and that this conversation was had about a crossfire. As far as Garrison's motives, I believe he was responding to the evidence that he saw in front of him. As noted in this episode, Garrison was not perfect by any means, but I also don't believe that he was out to destroy Clay Shaw. I think he thought Shaw was guilty. I also don't buy the argument that Garrison was just trying to advance his career. He had plenty of opportunities for career advancement if he would just let go of the case, but his career was actually wrecked because of his relentless pursuit of Clay Shaw. While I don't believe that he proved what he set out to prove, and neither did a unanimous jury, by the way, I do think that the Garrison case, combined with all of the information that we covered over the last several episodes, at a minimum, establishes the following. Clay Shaw, Lee Harvey Oswald, and probably David Ferry took a trip to Clinton and Jackson, Louisiana in the summer of 1963. This raises questions about how they knew each other and what they were doing. And there is strong evidence that Ferry knew Clay Shaw. It's highly likely that Clay Bertrand was Clay Shaw. We also learned that Clay Shaw was a frequent contact of the CIA. And Shaw probably did call Dean Andrews to represent Oswald. There's no reason for Andrews to make that up, and his secretary corroborates his call. Finally, we learned that David Ferry worked closely with Guy Bannister, who maintained ties with J. Edgar Hoover, and with Sergio Arcacha Smith, who led a CIA-sponsored Cuban exile group. Ferry was also the personal pilot for mafia boss Carlos Marcello and an investigator for Marcello's lawyer. Unfortunately, many of the details of these bona fide connections to the mafia, Cuban exiles, and intelligence agencies through David Ferry vanished with Ferry's death, which was just a few days after the Garrison investigation was announced and after Ferry himself predicted it. Next time on Solving JFK, we'll have the first of 2 recap and rebuttals episodes on New Orleans before moving on to Mexico City. If you heard anything that you believe is out of context, or if you have additional information to offer, you can let us know at solvingjfkpodcast@gmail.com. Please provide citations to the record for any fact that you're relying on. For transcripts, sources, and official podcast merchandise, visit solvingjfkpodcast.com.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Thanks for listening. Visit solvingjfkpodcast.com